Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. It is my great pleasure to host Sonja Vospernik, who's Associate Professor at BOKU University of Natural Resources in Vienna. She will talk about tree species growth response to climate in oak pine mixtures across Europe. And she'll start with a presentation that will be followed by a question and answer period. We plan to wrap up the official part by 9 a.m. Pacific time. Before I hand the floor over to Dr. Vospernik, I will first like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from my UBC office that is located on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. The land UBC is situated on has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam, who for millennia have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. Second, I would like to remind you that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the IUFRO webpage in the next few days. And third, I would like to acknowledge that this webinar is part of the 2023 Forest Mensuration and Modelling Chats, which are organized by IUFRO Research Group 401, Forest Mensuration and Modeling. And if you have any speaker suggestions, please email me at bianca.eskilsson@ubc.ca. As this is an IUFRO event, I would like to highlight IUFRO's mission to advance research excellence and knowledge sharing and to foster development of science-based solutions to forest-related challenges for the benefit of forests and people worldwide. The webinar series is being organized in the spirit of knowledge sharing and to allow for some interaction and networking across the globe. And now that I've covered the IUFRO requirements, please help me welcome Dr. Sonja Vospernik. And Sonja, you should be able to share the screen.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I will share the screen. Does it work?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for the very kind introduction. The topic I'm going to talk about in this Forest Mensuration and Modelling group today is tree species growth of oak and pine in mixture, a dynamic sensitive equilibrium. The talk I'm giving is based on a paper published in Forest Ecology and Management with a very similar title and has been written in collaboration with very many researchers across Europe. And I'd like to acknowledge their contribution to the paper and to this presentation, their input. So climate change, so recent climate change scenarios for Europe predict a rise in temperature of about 1 to 1.8 degree for moderate scenarios and of 3.3 and 5.7 degree according to the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. Precipitation is predicted to decrease in Southern Europe and increase in Northern Europe. And precipitation shifts from summer to winter months. All of these contribute to the fact that frequency and duration of drought periods are increasing. So tree growth reactions and understanding tree growth reactions to climate is a very important contemporary challenge in tree growth research. There are different ways where we can study these relationships. The highest resolution of tree growth is found in dendrometers, where we can register annual growth, hourly growth, and we got intra-annual growth patterns. So these are the strongest relationships between climate and tree growth that we can get. But usually this data is scarce because long-term measurements are lacking. Another way to look on tree growth and climate is yearings or stem analysis. It's the most common approach to relate climate to tree growth and has been done a lot in research. And finally, we can use forest inventory data, which is spatially explicit, widely available, but sometimes masks the climate growth relationships because usually we only measure growth on 5 or 10-year periods. There are numerous factors influencing tree growth, and we know really a lot of them, and this list is not finished. So tree growth is related to site, which represents the totality of the environment. So this is climate, soil type, soil moisture, and so on. Tree growth is related to tree species. It's related to mixture. It depends on age, on density. It's influenced by forest management. We know that the tree growth differences between social positions, and it differs by provenances. So there are so many factors that sometimes it's quite difficult to disentangle these factors and to find the growth relationships. In this paper, we focus on tree growth of oak and pine in mixed stands from tree ring data that we collected across Europe on 36 triplets consisting of pure and mixed stands of the respective species. So oak and pine are very light-demanding tree species that in Europe grow in mixture on xeric acidophilic sites. Quercus is quite thermophilic and is usually found on sites where the mean temperature during the vegetation period is larger than 8.4 degrees Celsius. Pinus sylvestris, on the other hand, spans a larger thermal gradient. Both species are drought tolerant. So Quercus species shows an isohydric behavior, which means that it keeps its stomata open very long under drought conditions, enduring very high water deficits. Typically, also the tree rings of Quercus therefore show less fluctuations than those of Pinus sylvestris, which is an isohydric species, which means that it closes its stomata very early under drought conditions, and it is more prone to carbon starvation. Quercus species are broad-leaved species and ring-porous species, whereas Pinus sylvestris is an evergreen conifer. What happens in mixture? So tree growth in mixtures for these two species are on the same plots. Positive mixture effects were observed at the stand level, which are 6 to 14% increase in productivity. This competitive advantage for Pinus sylvestris in this mixture in alignment with its ecology increases with height index and water supply. So Quercus is the more drought-tolerant tree species. What are these mixture effects made up? At the stand level, usually, stand density or density differences between the two species and stand structure contribute to positive mixture effects. At the tree level, causes for positive mixture effects can be root morphology, water and nutrient use strategy, leaf and composite tree phenology. So what were the hypotheses? We wanted to test. We assumed that across this very large gradient across Europe, tree growth reactions are site-specific, but we assumed patterns within the same bioclimatic region to be analogous. Tree growth reactions to drought we thought are species mixture and season-specific. Specifically, we assumed Quercus to be more drought-resistant and Pinus to be less drought-resistant and more cold-tolerant. We expect that both tree species react more sensitively on the drought-prone sites to climate, and both species react less sensitive in mixture. And finally, we assumed that the mixture effects are positive for both tree species and that such mixture effects also depend on the local competition. So this is the study sites. This is 37 triplets spanning gradient from the Mediterranean to the boreal zone. And you can see here in this left plot the mean annual temperature of the sites, with the warmer sites found in the south and the colder sites in the north, and quite a large number of plots here in the temperate zone. Here is the precipitation, the annual precipitation of the sites, and we can see here the sites with the least precipitation, and here in the Atlantic region, sites with precipitation. So there's quite a large environmental gradient in terms of mean annual temperature that we span with these triplet plots. What are these triplet plots? Such a triplet plots usually consists of 3 plots, and this graph shows one of them. So there's one plot of pure oak, one plot of pure pine, and a mixed plot consisting of the mixture of the 2 species. On each plot, all the 3 coordinates were measured. Trees were measured for dB age, they were measured for height, and measured for height to the crown base. For each plot, we tried to calculate various competition measures. Finally, we ended up with using measures of local competition. So what is meant by local competition can see in this, red circle here, and that's the radius where the competition was evaluated for the respective tree. So we chose a radius of 7 meters for each tree and calculated all measures for stand density, species proportion, and Gini coefficient only within this local environment of the tree itself. This radius of 7 meters, finally, there were 8 to 9 trees usually contained within such local competition zones, or at least 5 to 6 trees. The competition indices we calculated were then the stand density index, which is the stem number an equally dense stand would have at the reference diameter of 25 centimeters. The head index, which basically weights the tree in comparison to its subject tree by the inverse distance. So the quotient of the 2 diameters is multiplied by the inverse distance of the 2 trees. We calculated the species proportion also and accounted for species-specific density differences. So usually pine has 20 square meters more of maximum density than oak has, and the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of the inequality of the size distribution. From at least 20 dominant and 10 suppressed trees, increment cores were selected on each of the triplets. So here we have Quercus, Pinus, and the mixed plot from a plot in Poland. And these are the tree ring series that were cross-dated using standard dendrochronological techniques. We also calculated measurements for this tree ring series. So the inter-series correlation for Quercus for all triplets was ranged from 0.34 to 0.74. The expressed population signal was 0.61 to 0.69, and for Quercus, and 0.84 to 0.99 for Pinus sylvestris, respectively. So both measurements indicated that there is a climate signal in the tree ring data we collected, and that the tree ring series were correctly synchronized and matched. In these plots below, you can see the ring widths of an individual tree, and you can see here a spline function passing through this tree ring series, and the ring width index then obtained for the very same tree. So in standard dendrochronology, we would pass a spline through each series or a logarithmic function, calculate the ring width index, and then finally get the tree ring chronology. And such a tree ring chronology for the very same site now is shown here in this picture. So we would get the tree ring index for Quercus pinus and for the mixed plots based on the 25 trees on the first plot, the 25 trees on the second plot, and the 38 and 52 trees sampled in the mixed stand respectively. However, when we build such a chronology, we cannot use all the information in the individual tree ring series. So that's already averaged from all these tree ring values, basically. We were, however, interested in individual tree growth patterns and in analyzing this effect. So we took a different approach. We now used generalized additive models to model this tree ring series, so all of the series. What are generalized additive models? In generalized additive models, we have an expected value that depends on unknown smooth functions of the predictor variables. And the observed values are assumed to be of some type of exponential distribution family. Each of these smooth functions is composed of basis functions that add together the smooth term. So this is where basically the name comes from. This is a very flexible approach to model data, as you can see, and it can actually almost take any form and shape of a curve. So we don't want the model to be too flexible, as can be seen in the middle graph here, where it really starts to pass through every individual data point. So that would be overfitting. And the first graph on the left-hand side would be underfitting. We rarely have to take care of this ourselves, because in generalized additive models, the function that is maximized is the penalized residual sum of squares. So the sum of squares, and then there is a term alpha, which you can see in these graphs, and a penalty penalizing the wiggliness. So the first term would measure the closeness to the data, while the second term penalizes the curvature in a function based on the second derivatives, and alpha now establishes this trade-off. And in the very right picture, you can see this penalized estimation for a sine curve. So this is what how this penalized estimation looks like for an individual curve. Similar, we can also choose this exponential family. We could use a normal distribution, a Poisson distribution, a gamma distribution, or an inverse Gaussian distribution. What we really used is the Tweedie distribution that encompasses these exponential family distributions. It has 3 parameters, mu, sigma, and rho, and this parameter rho can be estimated based on the data within the GAM framework. So this is what we selected as exponential family distribution. The GAMs themselves also would fit an overall population model, but the data structure we have from these triplets is clearly a hierarchical structure with the tree rings clustered at the sites, at the individual 36 sites, and of course also the yearly measurements of growth correlated for each tree ring series. So we put mixed effects on this model. There was a random effect for site and year, trying to capture the site and year variation as random effect. And here for the correlation within tree correlation, there were random effects for tree and tree times age, which do a very similar thing than the trending in standard dendrochronology, which is passing a curve through each of these individual tree ring series. So this right term is really very similar to this trending, except that in this framework now we can keep it all in an overall model. This is very good if we have an overall model now, because this allows us to test for numerous factors. However, there is a problem really that is very notorious for in tree ring analysis or in any type of growth analysis. Usually there's high collinearity between the parameters, between the variables in the model. So in a linear model, collinearity does not violate the model assumption, but it inflates the variance, and it limits the use for inference and forecasting. So the estimates are not stable. If you add other variables, might get very different results. So unstable estimates are a real problem with collinearity. This is very difficult if you want to interpret the data. So, and it's one of the major problems in this overall growth models, that there's a lot of collinearity or concurvity usually present. What is concurvity? So concurvity really extends this concept of collinearity now to the GAM case. So that's a generalization. And it means that it's a situation where one smooth term can be approximated by some combination of others. And also here, it results in unstable estimates. So there's a little bit we can do from the modeling part. So there is an option to put a double penalty on the smooth, which reduces the concurvity problem, which we did. And there's also another way to deal with this concurvity problem, to avoid proxy variables that can be used for different variables in the model, or find variables that are independent of the effect of others. So what is meant by this? For example, dBH is a very difficult variable in forest growth models, because it can be a proxy for the influence of age, or it could be also a proxy for the influence of competition. Similarly, the variable year might capture age effects, might capture climate effect in different years. So selecting variables that are not concurve with the others can also be done by careful thinking and by looking at such concurvity diagnostics that are provided. So what was the final model then that we parameterized? We estimated the logarithm of the diameter increment based on mixture, age, on the local competition, on gene index, our structure index, the relative dBH, long-term mean temperature, and the potential evapotranspiration of the previous year, as well as the potential evapotranspiration of the current year and the interactions thereof with relative dBH. So what are the model effects that we got? There was close to linear decrease of age of our predictions for both tree species, which is quite similar. There was a decrease with competition, we can see here that these confidence intervals get very large for the higher competition values of local STI. There is an increase of tree growth with relative DPH for both tree species that also is quite similar. Gini coefficient was significant in the model. However, the interpretation of this behavior was not so clear in this modeling framework. We found an effect of a maximum growth of Quercus across our gradient with long-term mean temperature at 7 degrees, and the decrease of the growth of Pinus sylvestris with the long-term mean temperature of the site. What were the monthly climate reactions? We included the potential evapotranspiration of the previous month. The month of May was significant, the month of June was significant, and the month of July was significant for oak. So we found a decrease with PET in September, an increase in May, a decrease again in June, and an increase with PET in July. Note a very different scale of this axis. So the largest influence of tree growth we found with June PET, and very small values here for the increase in linear predictor are found for September PET. It looks very similar here for Pinus. The previous September values do not show a very clear pattern. Instead, we get a clear relationship here in April, a clear increase, a decrease in June, which is also the most pronounced in this month. And we get an optimum for PET in the month of July, basically. We extracted the random components for year and site, basically, and tried to find some other patterns to reveal. And we found that really these yearly patterns of the two species at the same site varied very strongly. They're not so synchronous as we would have expected. So in one year, there's a competitive advantage for one tree species, and in other years, there's a competitive advantage for the other species. So such competitive advantages clearly can shift between species at the same site during time. We also looked at the random effects for the sites, and looking at these random effects, and you saw this small video here, these random effects really changed through time, but it didn't reveal any pattern between the Mediterranean or the boreal forest. So we didn't see any additional trend here in patterns. So this is really what we got. How do we interpret this result? So these large scale patterns really change with yearly climate. So this climatic zones are the part, or some of the climate variation can be explained, but some of the residual patterns just still remain and change with yearly climate. The tree species mixture of Quercus and Pinus sylvestris had a positive impact in our study, but the impact is small compared to the climatic variation. And we found these competitive advantages really to be shifting between the species and be shifting with the years. So if we measure only 1 year, one species might have an advantage. It might be the exact opposite the year after. So basically the species at the same site are sort of in an equilibrium. So 1 year it's one species that has an advantage over the other, and this might shift 2 or 3 years later, and increasing climate warming might really change this shift, or shift the competitive advantage towards Quercus species, which are more able to endure drought. The patterns of the yearly climatic influences we got are really in line with what we observe in the Andrometer studies. So the direction, the magnitude, and the causal factors of climate effects clearly vary throughout the year. And this is linked to tree ring formation, basically, which usually lasts several weeks, 2 to 3 weeks at least, or 4 weeks. And during the year, there are different triggers on tree growth. So in spring, soils are generally water saturated, at least on the sites where we observe these two species. At the start, or the start of tree growth here is linked usually to increasing temperatures and sometimes also to increasing daylight availability. The largest effect in such the Andrometer studies, or the largest growth rates, we usually get around the summer solstice. So it's thus not surprising that the June climate has the strongest influence on tree growth, because this is the month of the most rapid growth. So when days are longest, there's the longest time to perform photosynthesis, and there tree growth is usually restricted, at least on these xeric sites, by a lack of water. Already in July, basically, trees switch to late wood formation, which does not contribute that much to the tree ring as a whole anymore. And in autumn, usually carbohydrates are stored for the next year. So oak is a tree species that relies very much on these carbohydrates of the past year. Up to 30% of the year are formed on stored carbohydrates, because it's a tree species that forms next year's ring based on carbohydrates before the tree flushes. This is not true for pine, and might explain this very clear relationship with September pet we get for oak, and this not so clear relationship for pine. Also, that we already get an April effect for pine, which starts to grow usually earlier than oak, seems to be in line with what we observe also from intraannual growth studies. So this modeling framework with random effects is very good to capture such climate growth relationships. It's quite unlikely that such true functions are linear, although many of the ones you saw on the plot are close to linear. Nevertheless, this GAM framework can attribute here for nonlinear functions in the data. The random effects account for the hierarchical data structure, and really we can model these tree ring patterns very well, explaining 87% of the total variance in the data set. Only 38 to 41.9% can be explained by the fixed effects. So there's still some things that we might want to understand here, and we might be worthwhile to increase this proportion to better understand the climate and tree growth data. And with that, I'm at the end, sorry. With that, I'm at the end of this talk, and I want to thank all my co-authors for valuable contribution. And if you're interested, all the details also can be found in Forest Ecology and Management.
Thank you for the great presentation. Before we move into the question and answer period, I am going to quickly share my screen to draw everyone's attention to the upcoming webinars. So next month on April 25th, we'll have Dr. David Forster from Australia give the webinar on modeling mixtures in uneven aged forests, which will be a nice follow-up on looking at oak pine mixtures today. And then in May, Dr. Francisco Mauro and Dr. Bryce Frank will talk about small area estimation. And in October, Dr. Stella Britvom-Aqua will talk about assessment of deforestation and forest degradation in community resource management areas. Just a reminder, and I'll put this in the chat shortly also, you can get updates on the webinars if you subscribe to the Division 4 mailing list. Because I do send, also all webinars are posted on the IUFRO calendar. And if you have other speaker suggestions, please email me. And so thank you for your attention. And with that, I will stop the recording in just a little bit.